Hi. So I wanted to talk about something that I've kind of mentioned before in other videos. I've mentioned a few times that foreigners who come to Korea tend to become really bitter and jaded. So I've found this to be true in personal interactions with other foreigners, on Facebook groups for people in Korea, and on the popular teaching resource website for teachers in Korea called Waygook.org. Side note, Waygook means foreigner in Korean. That's where the name comes from. And speaking to other foreigners in Korea, I found that there's a general consensus that not all, but a decent percentage of foreigners who come to live in Korea seem to become really bitter and jaded and angry about Korean culture. And now, never having taught in another country, I'm not sure if this phenomenon is exclusive to Korea, or maybe if it occurs in every country where foreigners live amongst majority, which is, I guess, every country in the world. That being said, I do have a theory as to why this happens, despite my entire lack of knowledge about the phenomenon in general. But I think there are two big factors at play. There may be others, but these were the two that were very salient or obvious to me. So these are the ones I'm going to talk about. The first factor in making a bitter foreigner is the extent to which a foreigner is a minority in the country that they are now living in, or the host country. That is, the less there are of people who are like you or who you deem to be like you in the country in which you are living, the more alienated and the more of an outsider you might perceive yourself to be. From statistics I've read, the population of Korea is 96% Korean, 2% Chinese, and 2% other, which is a whole group of people, but a small percentage. So, if you're an English teacher in Korea, a foreign English teacher in Korea, possibly even more specifically a foreign teacher in Korea with a non-East Asian racial background, you might see yourself as being a really small minority. The small aside to this is that as a white foreign English teacher, I have no idea what it would be like to be a foreign English teacher with an East Asian racial background. It's possible that people who come from a foreign country but look East Asian might feel more welcome or less welcome because they look like the native population a little bit, or if they're treated as more of an outsider. I don't know. I only know from my experience, and I don't think that the Korean people confuse me as one of their own. I don't think so. Anyways, being that Korea has such a homogeneous population, I would theorize that foreigners might experience a lot of strain that minorities typically feel in other countries. In American social justice circles, they speak about things called microaggressions. These are small statements that are said to people such as minorities, usually unintentionally, with no ill meaning behind them, that serve to make the minority feel like an outsider, or they serve to otherize that minority. So people will say things like, "Where are you from?" "Can you eat spicy food?" We've been over this. People don't think I can eat spicy food. Or like, "Wow, you use chopsticks really well." Like I should be disabled when using chopsticks. Or, "Wow, you speak Korean so well." When all I said was something like "안녕하세요," which just means hello. Very simple stuff. Now these things seem and should seem really innocuous, but they can serve as a constant reminder that you are an other. And being that I am such a small minority in this country, they're said really often. A similar, maybe more relatable phenomenon to some people would be if you've ever worked in customer service on cash, and customers will always repeat things like, "Oh, if it doesn't scan, it's free." Or if you have a degree in psychology or you studied psychology, and people will always respond with, "Ooh, you're trying to analyze me," when that just makes me analyze you as a dumbass. So things like that can be really annoying when repeated over and over and over. But for me, I see these constantly repeated questions as kind of a quirky thing that I have to deal with as someone living as a minority as a small minority in a country. But that being said, I know that other foreigners can get really, really frustrated with these little statements. And other than these microaggressions, there are many little things that serve to remind you that you are a foreigner, that you don't quite belong. It's not like the country itself is not welcoming, but there's just little teeny reminders. They're very insidious, very small, very hard to see, but they add up over time. So it seems obvious that being a minority can be like a really strong factor in creating a jaded foreigner. So in addition to being a part of a minority, a small minority, the second factor in creating bitter and jaded foreigners, I think, is how different the host culture is from the foreigner's native culture. More specifically, I would say that how similar the host country and the origin country's standards of politeness or common courtesy line up. So the less the two cultures line up in terms of politeness or courtesy, I think the more unwelcome or the more uneasy or more stressed a foreigner might feel. I think specifically here, if a culture does not have the same standard or concept of common courtesy than the foreigner's culture, there might be a lot of friction. And interestingly enough, we call it common courtesy as if it's a global phenomenon, when really, I guess my standard of common courtesy would be maybe Canadian common courtesy, or maybe British Columbian common courtesy, or even like lower mainland common courtesy. It really is hard to, I guess, understand that your standard of common courtesy might not extend as far as you think it does. And in Korea, I feel like there are a lot of standards of courtesy that are very different from Canadian standards of courtesy. So this can cause a lot of friction. So with those two factors, one, being a minority, being an increasingly small minority, and two, living in a culture that is different from your own, I think Korea specifically is poised to create some really bitter, jaded foreigners. And it should be noted that these are only external factors, so there are also internal factors, so psychological, personality, or dispositional characteristics that can cause some individuals to be more predisposed to becoming a bitter and negative foreigner than other non-bitter foreigners. And as a side note, I think this whole thing can really be simplified to the more stresses a person encounters in a foreign country, the less positive they're going to feel towards that country. But I overcomplicated it. So there. And honestly, for myself, over the past few months, I've started to maybe tumble into this spiral of bitterness and jadedness. Little things that I used to shrug off have really, really been getting to me. I think that the possible reason for this is a few stressors that are going on in my life. But my point is that if you are under stress, it is really, really difficult to shake off these little things that seemed so insignificant before. I think that all of these things have an additive effect. They add up eventually. And if you don't take the time to breathe and gain some perspective, then they can really get to you. So I have a bit of newfound empathy for the people who come to Korea and turn into negativity machines. Before, I just thought that they needed to smarten up. But now I kind of get it. That being said, I think that the people who do become like this need to take a breather. They really need to look at what is stressing them out and decide if they can, one, get rid of it, or two, if that's not possible, to distance themselves from it, or three, if those are not possible, to really reevaluate why it upsets them, or if it's really even worth getting upset about. Honestly, our brains are wired in such a way to pay more attention to negative messages. Negative messages carry a lot more weight in our brains than positive messages. We have evolved in a way where our minds need to pay attention to the dangers in our landscape. We need to avoid danger and death. So when we hear stories that are deeply personal and tragic, they light up those same danger sensors in our mind. Danger circuits in our mind. And our mind tends to hold on to these stories for longer in order to survive. And if you look at modern media and news, they know this tactic. They know how our brains work. So all the stories that come out have a negative spin, even if it's something positive. Like, look at recently, Pokemon Go was released, and there are all these stories out there about how negative and terrible it is, and it was a game, or is a game, that's getting people to explore their neighborhoods for the first time, to get out, get some exercise, meet their neighbors for the first time. It's kind of a profound instrument of social change. I think it's a great thing, but there's so many negative stories about it. People are acting like it's like some new form of cancer or something. So we hear these messages and we're surrounded by these messages, and so we start broadcasting our own because it seems like a good way to get attention at first. Like in Korea, you can't find deodorant. Deodorant is really hard to find. I had to get people to bring me deodorant. And so people put things like that on social media, like, ugh, I can't find deodorant. And people relate to that and like your status, and you feel validated, and then from there it just starts snowballing, I think. And then suddenly you're complaining about the construction sites, or your neighbors chewing too loudly, or some other inane bullshit like that. The problem is that so many people are just all too willing to put out negative messages out there because they provoke a response. And this might be disproportionately larger amongst minority communities who feel ostracized, like ESL teachers in Korea. But honestly, I think this is a problem with the entire planet. And the problem is exacerbated by the fact that we're constantly next to these portals that contain all this negative information in an easily accessible format. And so it's really, really hard to escape it. I guess this is getting a little ranty. I just would like to put out there that if you're feeling stressed by something, you really should look at it and try to reevaluate your perspective on it. And today I heard a very good quote, which I think kind of sums this up nicely. And the quote goes like this: "You will continue to suffer if you have an emotional reaction to everything that is said to you. True power is sitting back and observing everything with logic. True power is restraint. If words control you, that means everyone else can control you. Breathe and allow things to pass." And this is from something called the Mind Journal. I don't know, I found it on Reddit. But that being said, the world can really get you down. There are a lot of really, really negative things out there. And yes, it's reasonable to be upset over injustice, pain, or suffering. But that being said, if you allow yourself to wallow or to dwell on everything negative that's going on around you, you start to feel powerless. And my point is that you should take some time to reevaluate, because there is just way too much beauty in the world to quit. There's a lot of really, really amazing stuff out there. And yet people seem to think that the world is worse than it's ever been, when it's really, really getting a lot better. So don't get caught on all the negatives. And as the Koreans always say, in an unintentionally condescending kind of way, cheer up.